Hello, guys. Hope everyone's doing all right. Torque here, coming in with something that someone that I've always had a high admiration for in regards to Cornel West. Um, Throughout my my college years, one of the things I always seeked out was just that influence that I could kind of grab onto in regards to philosophy and thinking. So Cornel West was actually one of those people that caught my eye. Funny enough, the guy has actually been around for a long time. And when you consider his role in The Matrix and some other movies, and also the fact that he has all this he has a credibility that's really eye-opening when you consider some of the ambitions as a scholar, as someone that seeks knowledge, someone that those kind of ideas that you kind of drift into. So basically I will be doing a review today on one of his major books, which is Race Matters. I've listened to so many YouTube videos on Cornel West throughout college. I used to kind of fall asleep just listening to them in the background. But just going over some of his credentials. Right now, he is a professor of philosophy and Christian practice at Union Theological Seminary and professor emeritus at Princeton University. He also has taught at Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. And also, one of the things that you can see that is currently happening is his position in trying to become president. So I'm eager to see the progress in this campaign. Nonetheless, um, I try to stay away from politics, but again, the reason I gravitated towards him was as a black engineer in my discipline. I was just looking for that outward thinking influence, and I was fortunate enough to land on him. So to make long story short, let's get started on this review. And so this was one of the presentations he had in 2001. I believe it was in April 27th, 0427, 2001 at University of Washington in Seattle. So I'm just gonna be stopping here and there just to give my thoughts on some of the things that I hear. He's a very philosophical person, so sometimes it's almost like, oh, I don't know about those Greek gods, those people, those Plato, those Socrates. When he starts mentioning, or when he gets into the black dynamic in regards to jazz or blues, or even when he starts talking about segregation, things like that, it might not make sense to, if you're not exposed to that kind of background. It might not make sense, but nonetheless, I say just try to stay within it. Try to just get the knowledge from wherever you can within this. Try to filter out the information, but nonetheless, I think he's a great guy to listen to and a great influence. He's definitely been a great influence so far. So let's get started.
Definitely.
One of the things I also wanted to mention is pretty much I'm very fond of how thankful he is at the beginning of his speeches in regards to giving credit to the people that kind of showed him love there. He's such a loving person, and that's one of the things I try to model myself after him in regards to just being that loving, just working for the best in every situation, right? So yeah, sorry again.
Thank you very much, though. Definitely.
By
Thank you so
the
very
way,
much.
I'm
What a blessing
claiming
to be
fair use
here.
on this, fair use, in case there's any problem. I just find this very informative, so I'm using it. Fair use.
University of Washington, Seattle. I'd like to thank my new friend and sister, Vice Provost Marsha Landau, for those very kind and generous remarks. I'd like to thank my new friend and sister, Yvette Fields, for not only picking me up at the airport and engaging in such high quality conversation, but being so warm and hospitable. And similarly so for Sister Essence Pierce. I had a wonderful dinner just a few minutes ago and met Brother Kip Shoke, who read a powerful poem, who happened to be the grandson of my masterful Sunday school teacher. Shiloh Baptist Church in Sacramento, California. Name was Sarah Ray. We wrestled with the book of Job that would make both Jung and Kierkegaard proud. Carol Lee Dance was there. We thank her so very much for both her family's generosity as well as her deep concern about the quality of intellectual life here at University of Washington. And as you can imagine, I do have a few friends here. I've got to say something about the brilliant young philosopher, Professor Paul Taylor, who's a very good friend of mine. I don't know whether he's here, but if he is, when you see him, give him a hug for me, because he has not just great promise, but already exemplified much of it.
So I'm going to go ahead and skip over to the main talking points, but nonetheless, those are the kind of things that I was talking about in regards to how he just embraces the people that bring him on and just kind of give them credit where credit is due. He could go on for this for like the next 10 minutes. So I'll just skip through that in order to get us started here.
If you are studying for your FE or PE exam, you need a review course that works for you. At School of PE, we have a
Wanted pain. We miss him so. We miss
Yeah, he could go on
him
for
so.
minutes, but he's about to get started.
And I think it's appropriate in talking about race matters.
Yeah. Again, thank you guys for
Keep in
coming.
mind the role of.
If you're enjoying contents like this, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. And definitely, I think we're gonna have a lot of conversations on topics like this in regards to just kind of like the awakening of the mind that seems to be happening in society. So, yeah.
The courageous artists, and that's why I begin on a Socratic note. I hope that I say something that thoroughly unsettles you. That's what we're here for. Not proselytizing, not advertising. We're here to be unnerved, maybe even for an instant unhoused. I cannot conceive of talking about any evil, any form of unjustified suffering and unnecessary social misery, any form of undeserved harm or unwarranted pain, without talking about the need for courage. What I love about Socrates is flat nose and pop belly, pop eyes, supposedly ugly in this public space of Athens, is that he went about trying to raise very painful questions. The queries that we rather not ask, but know we cannot sidestep or hold at arm's length. The unexamined life is not worth living. You all know that better than most at University of Washington. It's elite institutional higher learning, fundamentally committed to the quest for true, small t, knowledge, small k. Plato, the Apology in line 38a says the unexamined life is not the life for the human being. But Malcolm X added on the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, the examined life is painful. And who will muster the courage to use and deploy their critical intellect? I didn't say intelligence, I said intellect. Richard Hofstadter is right in his classic Anti-Intellectualism in America of 1963. America praises intelligence, but fears intellect.
Yeah. So, regards to some of the points he was bringing up, it's so crazy when we consider how, like, in society, we're consistently adjusting from the switches that tends to come from intelligence to like basically you start off on the path where you're thinking education is the key, right? Like it's this practical sense of you're trying to you have to work on the path of education, but when you actually get there, it's almost like now you have to deal with the political sense where it's not really about education, it's more about how you how utilizable you are. So in saying that, it completely deviates from the initial point of what you're trying to what you thought it was in regards to education. The political part that backs that up just kind of makes it a distraction and a deterrent. And when we get back to the point where it made in regards to what Socrates said regarding the unexamined life is not worth living, or like that's one of those things where it's almost like that's self-reflection, because that's what I think that phrase always ties to, that consistent self-reflections that we have to go through in life. Because at the end of the day, as Malcolm said, as you heard him say, like, the fact of the matter is, when we actually take the time to actually analyze ourselves, analyze some of the fact that we made mistakes here and there based on the ignorance, right? The ignorance that we didn't have, the ignorance of the moment, right? What, you kicked that, you didn't know your feet was gonna hurt. Now your feet hurts. Now you're thinking backwards in regards to like the ignorance of like, what if you had known that your foot would have hurt like that? Would you still have kicked it? So in saying that, not doing that self-reflection to actually put things in place for yourself as to like how you can move forward, because it's a consistent cycle in life that we live. So in saying that, the unexamined life is absolutely not worth living, because at the end of the day, those pains are there. So they're meant to be felt.
Business civilization. It's a market-driven civilization. Who has time to wrestle with the frightening questions? And of course, race, the vicious legacy of white supremacy, has been for so long a dogma in American history. We hit it hard in 1861. We hit it again in the 1960s. But for the most part, it's still one of those tacit assumptions and presuppositions we'd rather sidestep and hold at arm's length. Quest for self-knowledge. What kind of person are you and I really? What kind of community, what kind of nation are we really? Do we have the courage to look ourselves in the mirror candidly, critically, honestly, and acknowledge the underside, the night side of ourselves, the human predicament, American democracy, the world? William Butler Yeats is right when he says it takes more courage to dig deep into the abyss of one's own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. And you can't talk about race and race matters and diversity without wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy, in which it takes such tremendous courage to think critically about ourselves. That race is not some ghettoized peripheral issue. It has to do with the quality of persons that we think we are, the quality of American society that we think we are, and in the end, the quality of the species, humanity as a whole. Now, I'm sure many students here at this grand university will never forget those moments in which you look closely at your assumptions and presuppositions and recognize that your worldview rests on pudding.
What if you can make YouTube money without ever being a YouTuber? That's why I'm pulling the curtains back in 100%.
That's one of the differences between education and credentialization.
That's a big point.
That's one of the differences between acknowledging change, transformation, metamorphosis as a result of critical thinking and critically engaging the underside of who you are, the underside of American democracy. And yet at the same time, we recognize that it's so easy to fall back into those habits of thinking and expectation and orientation, business as usual. Now, granted, Socrates, like Jesus, never wrote a word, and I don't encourage that for undergrads or graduate students here. University of Washington, write your papers, put forward your nuanced formulations and sophisticated interpretations, adduce your evidence, draw your valid conclusion. Hope your professors understand the argument. And it's not really true, of course. Socrates did write at the very end of his life in prison a hymn to Apollo and versified the fables of Aesop. He began to take seriously that voice that he heard throughout his life Socrates practiced music. Socrates practiced music. Maybe you need some art to free you from the tyrannical rule of reason that you think results in the level of self-mastery and control that allows you to control those deep appetites. What's fascinating about Socrates, and it's pointed out by Leo Strauss in his 1958 lectures, University of Chicago, on the problem of Socrates. Socrates laughed once. If we take seriously the four sources that render the agent of Socrates, Plato's dialogues, profound, often unpersuasive. Xenophon's less profound but fascinating dialogues. Of course, the satirical depiction of Socrates in the Clouds by Aristophanes, and of course Aristotle's cold and disinterested analysis of Socrates' views. But he laughed once when he was asked, "How should we bury you?" And he said, "Anyhow, if you can catch me." But that's interesting to me. He laughed once, and not only that, but we never find that he wept as much as once. No tears. Married to Xanthippe, 3 sons, no tears. As important as thinking critically is in relation to wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy, the Socratic embodiment of the legacy of Athens is a necessary but not sufficient condition for wrestling with race. And that's why I take seriously the legacy of Jerusalem. Jeremiah wails and Elijah cries and Jesus weeps because they love so deeply, they care so much. And we will never be able to come to terms with race matters unless we confuse a spirituality of genuine questioning, interrogating, scrutinizing, pushing ourselves against the wall, but at the same time allowing tears to flow precisely because one has to open one's soul and acknowledge one is not always in control. Some passion, some connection to something bigger than oneself, to situate oneself in a story larger than oneself, to be able to locate oneself in a narrative grander than oneself. Break out.
Yeah, that's one of those. That's one of the things that essentially separates him and puts him in that position of someone with a high moral compass, right? Because when you consider the way he's breaking that down, you could kind of see the angle in which he's showing out that for you to be able to really attach to someone, to be able to really contribute to someone else's progress, you have to really have that much empathy, that deep love, that deep sense of like it's uncontrollable, right? It's uncontrollable because to others you might be known as a stiff person and still person, very serious. But then because of the fact that you love so hard, that love essentially just kind of takes you like it just shows how much you care and how much you can actually connect with people. Essentially, that differentiator of like people that actually know how to like empathize and actually like see you for who you are, how you are, without you adjusting or changing to anything. So yeah.
Out of the egocentric predicament. Exactly. Exactly. They acknowledge that reality of the other, capital O, that Levinas, Simone Weil, Dostoevsky, and Ellison and Toni Morrison encourage us to do. How do we bring together the spirituality of genuine critical questioning with the spirituality of genuine compassion and service to others? And by spirituality, I'm not talking about some ephemeral phenomenon. I know in the academy, and people talk about spirituality, think of New Age and a whole host of other popular phenomena. But no, by spirituality, I mean self-involved and self-invested struggle that takes us outside of our own self and connects us to others, ideals, causes, movements, social momentum. And of course, I could simply provide a grand example of that spirituality of critical questioning and spirituality of deep love and compassion by turning on John Coltrane's Love Supreme and just sit down. Just shut my mouth. I'll read a chapter, Toni Morrison's Beloved. A key track of that American Hamlet, Blanche DuBois, The Streetcar Named Desire, that white blues brother born in Columbus, Mississippi, named Tennessee Williams. Meaning what? Meaning that as artists, they exemplify both the Socratic moment on the one hand, but also the prophetic moment on the other. Condition of truth is to allow critical intellect to be displayed and enacted. Condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. That sits at the center of the struggle for freedom, and especially the struggle for freedom of people of African descent. It's two fundamental questions that sit at the very core of that struggle. And of course, it's always a tradition of struggle that says, whosoever will, let him or her come, if you're willing to pay the cost. If you're willing to make a fundamental decision to keep track of the humanity of each and every one of us, whatever the evil, white supremacy, male supremacy, vast economic inequality, national arrogance, class haughtiness, losing sight of humanity, disabled people, elderly, gay brothers, lesbian sisters. This is not cheap PC chit chat. We're talking about historical challenges. When I think back to Harriet Tubman's, Ida B. Wells Barnett's, A. Philip Randolph's, Martin King's, Fannie Lou Hamer's, white brothers like Miles Horton. I'm sure they have his autobiography, The Long Haul, in this glorious library here. Hope it's been checked out repeatedly. Lydia Maria Child, a white sister that wrote Appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans in 1833, responding to the great David Walker's appeal of 1829. They're wrestling with first the question of what does it mean to be human? Especially in light of a vicious of white supremacy in which people's humanity is perennially called into question, interrogated, has to be proven, never taken for granted. Told they have the wrong hips and lips and noses and hair texture and skin pigmentation, and the world begins to believe. Told they're less beautiful, less intelligent, less moral.
Yeah. So pretty much when we consider some of the foundation is already set so far in regards to how he's building this conversation, right? Starts off with Socrates in regards to Socrates and Malcolm X's dynamic of an unexamined life is not a life worth living. And then Malcolm X coming in with the examined life is hard. It's suffering, right? Nonetheless, the idea is that the path in life that we have to take is one that we have to do that self-reflection consistently. Meaning you're finding your sense of purpose as to why you're here, right? So in saying that, we then break it down to the fundamental principle in which race plays a part, right? And the identity of why we here as black Americans or black Africans or black Caribbeans, the identity that we live on is one that as a society within society is one that starts at the bottom, right? When of course we have the anomalies and people that could be intellectual and stand out. But nonetheless, the foundation in which we live in as a society is one that is so below the standard in which we know from those that are in the intellectual level know that it's something that we're capable of doing as a group, opposed to just having one individuals here and there. So now when we tie it back to like the dynamic of like how race plays a part, that goes back to that self-reflection, right? The unexamined life. As we examine our life as African Americans, we actually have to also examine the life of white America, Asian America, right? we have to Hispanic America, right? We have to be able to examine that also, right? And that is the overall ideology that I'm getting so far. But then that's that deep self-reflection that comes into play when you could actually sit back and critically analyze the situations that you see. So now Tyne is slowly going towards the race dynamic, which is the meat of this conversation. Hence the name Race Matters. So I'll get back to it now. Again, thank you guys for joining me. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll definitely come up with more conversations like this. That and again, I've been a student of Cornel West per YouTube for years now. So I know there's a lot of clips in which, though some of the things sound redundant, it hits differently in the different settings that he's in. So this is just one of them.
Rationalization for subjugation and subordination, enslavement, Jim Crow, Jane Crowed, discriminated against. Not solely as victims, our right-wing brothers and sisters are wrong.
You know, you have to ask yourself as a leader, what is your responsibility? It's not what you could do individually, it's that what you
Never solely as victims. The victimization has been in place, but the sense of agency has always been exercised and enacted. When you look at the best of the struggle for freedom in the midst of this American civilization that presupposed that it was the exemplar of freedom and liberty. What does it really mean to be human? Now, you all know from your classes here that the English word human derives from the Latin humando, which means burying. Burying, I like to remind professors of humanity about that. You know, you are the ones into those bodies in the coffin. Those bodies that are now the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. Yes, why? Because at that particular moment, the three dimensions of time are brought together: past, present, and future, especially in a civilization so obsessed with futurity, but shuns the past and views the future as simply a repetition of the present. And doesn't want to view that future as qualitatively different, forcing us to interrogate the most fundamental and basic institutional and structural arrangements, just everybody fitting in, even as things become more colorful among the middle and upper middle classes and well-to-do, but the class hierarchy still in place. Their imperial policy still in place, oftentimes, though not always. What does it really mean to be human? Well, you see, when you actually look at the history of spirituals, oh Lord, how come I born here? So Sophoclean in insight, or the blues, or jazz, or rhythm and blues, and yes, even a little hip hop too. They remind us that we are fundamentally two-legged, linguistically, two-legged. Let me say that again. I want you to get this point. I want you to get this point. That we are fundamentally two-legged, featherless, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces. See, that's the discourse of the funk in the history of black freedom. It's not something to be laughed at. See, when Ezra Pound said that Walt Whitman is an exceeding stench, but he is America, and he's from Idaho, you know. He said it in London. Black folks say, no, you think the stench and the stink is where you start. No. We start with the funk. We start with the raw history, the raw reality, and the mortality denied by most of American culture and civilization. That we are a people who have been on intimate terms with forms of death in the most death-denying, death-ducking, and death-dodging of all modern civilizations. The mainstream may go sentimental and talk about purity and he or she who was pristine and Op 40 happy ending, but we start with slavery, a form of social death in the midst of this death-denying civilization. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about race and the legacy of white supremacy, one of the reasons why we usually have to wait for a catastrophe and crisis to hit before we wrestle with the issue head on, is because we live in such a shallow and hollow culture that is so obsessed with comfort and convenience and contentment, they don't want to deal with the funk. They don't want to deal with the raw reality. They don't want to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, who wants to get out their comfort zone to actually deal with the reality that at the end of the day, we're a society. But to answer this question, yeah, nobody really wants to deal with it. But one thing I do want to point out is like we're a society that is forced to be grouped together in a with one identity, but nonetheless within that dynamic, there's always a tribalism or separation here and there that kind of makes that general covering of saying black just kind of become very problematic, right? In regards to just putting one group of people in a bunch and saying this is how everybody is, okay, right? And in saying that, that's kind of like one of those games that, as a society, we're trying to fight against, but nonetheless, it's just like there's multiple structure, multiple layers, in which is kind of like makes it a very hard, makes it very hard to really say I want to deal with the problem, right? Rather than trying to fix the problem, it's almost like I'm comfortable enough. I'm just gonna stay where I'm at. So yeah, I definitely agree with what he's saying there.
The darkness that is shot through not just America, but every civilization.
Exactly. It's tough.
No accident that Disneyland and Disney World brag that no one has ever died on their premises. Quintessentially American. Nobody died. Is there life there? No, it's just fun. Oh. Yes. The great Heidegger, in his book of 1939, Homo Ludens, says fun was a term constructed and concocted in America. What a privileged and spoiled folk to think that somehow they can make it through history and not confront the tragic and comic dimensions of the world. Remain sentimental, skate through history in the form of what? Absolute denial, for the most part, of the forms of death. It's no accident the U.S. Constitution doesn't even refer to slavery, slaves, or Negroes. You've all seen Joseph Ellis's new book, Founding Brothers. It's on the bestseller list. Surprised me, America's a strange place. Because it's a serious book, and you don't usually see serious text on that list. Take a look at that chapter 3 called The Silence and the consensus of the Founding Brothers to not come to terms with the petition of the Quakers to deal with slavery, sidestep it, overlook it. 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies enslaved Africans. But somehow think that, as Malcolm used to say, the chickens won't come home to roost, that history won't haunt you. The same is true in the discourse of innocence. America is unique among modern nations to believe that it began with innocence.
Yeah, and to his point, you could get one thing I always say is nature never lies. It always tries to equate whatever equation has been altered. Just like he's saying, right? That's nature in action, right? Nonetheless, we don't have to. There shouldn't be this fear dynamic of, oh my God, because I'm white, I feel like I'm gonna be punished by this dynamic. Like, no, that shouldn't be, unless you could clearly see patterns in your own society that shows it. I don't think it's something to be feared. I think it's just one of those things that ties back to that self-reflection, right? Like, at the end of the day, it was a small percentage of white America that actually owned slaves. That doesn't justify it, and that doesn't minimize the effects of it as a society. Nonetheless, the idea of the self-reflection is that you could be authentic enough to know that your path is straight. for you not to have the phobia, the sense of anxiety that, and that's not to pander to one race over the other. As we do this reflection, the purpose of me finding that balance is one that is just saying, I don't want there to be this unnecessary negative energy that's being pushed on the self-reflection that another race is doing, right? And in saying that, for that race to actually progress, to actually help society as a whole, it's okay to step back and do your own self-reflection as a white person and say, I don't have that same path with you, but I could support your struggles as most white people have in the past. On all the Underground Railroad, some of the safe houses were white people, if I remember correctly. So I'm saying that there's a dynamic of white people that are always there to help. This is not to antagonize them. If you could do the self-reflection to know that you've always contributed in a positive way, right? And continue just being yourself, opposed to thinking this is an attack. And on the black dynamic, this is a perfect opportunity to do the dirt self-reflection in order to bring out the identity in which you were never always bad people. When nature, when the nature of the civilization was collapsing and it fell on the black community, it was felt around the world. Nonetheless, there's the conversation and having the voice to actually project the problem that we're having that occurred essentially in a intellectual and a positive manner and in a way that makes you actually do the self-reflection is exactly what it's getting at. Nothing incepted out of beauty. I mean, nothing. Most of the things that grow, it's never perfect initially. For a flower to blossom, it has to come from a seed, right? So in saying that the chickens coming home to roost is not an attack on saying, oh, Black America is going to come after. No, it's not all of that. All it's saying is this is a different dynamic in which the self-reflection is going to bring out the struggles and just let the people that were meant to flourish. But I'm going to get back to it.
F.O. Matheson, the towering Harvard literary critic and Christian socialist and gay brother who taught in Cambridge for 42 years, used to begin many of his lectures by saying, would America be unique among modern nations to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity? That's a serious question. You might grow old and you might grow big, but when will you grow up? Race is a litmus test, not just for justice, it's a litmus test for maturity. Peter Pan mentality, young forever. No history, no time, no mortality. Selective memory. And yet we know 1861, we fight a war over an institution not even invoked in the Constitution. 13th Amendment refers to an institution not even alluded to in the Constitution. Mendacity, hypocrisy. So, oh, Brother West, you're a little hard on America. It's a much more complex place than that. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. First 72 years of the Republic, 49 years were headed by presidents who were slaveholders. The only presidents reelected during that period were slaveholders. The majority of Supreme Court were Southerners, most of them slaveholders. Very complicated democracy. Seneca put it so well when he said that he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. Montaigne says to philosophize is to learn how to die. Plato has Socrates say philosophy itself is a meditation on and preparation for death. Because to live critically, intensely, and abundantly is to confront forms of death. You can't produce spirituals in the blues, Sarah Vaughan, or Curtis Mayfield, without wrestling with the legacies of forms of death with which people of African descent have had to wrestle with. Not the only ones, I'm just using this one example because there's such an exemplary group.
That balance
in this regard.
Not one over the other, just saying
1861, war. And I think about the discussion these days about the flag in South Carolina and Mississippi. And I say to myself, my God, what an impoverished discourse. To think that that flag is fundamentally about black pain on the one hand and the valor of white soldiers and the Confederacy on the other. Nobody wants to say it, but it was about the possible death of American democracy. It was the violent, organized insurrection to overthrow the U.S. government. And that's not the Black Panther Party, that's the Confederacy I'm talking about. It had to do with notions of democracy and citizenship. It's not just about black folk over here and white Southerners over there. You didn't even hear it articulated because our imagination when it comes to race is so eviscerated. The denial is still so much at work that it's just about responding to the psychological sensitivities of this group. And the psychological sensitivities of this, no. Race has been, we know, not just the most explosive issue, not just the most difficult dilemma, not just America's rawest nerve. It has the capacity to ring down the curtain on American democracy. It almost did. And it may almost again. Every chocolate city is a ticking time bomb. Cincinnati is just the peak of it.
That's kind of interesting that he brings that up. This was in 2001, guys. Right? That the crazy thing about what he just brought up is simply that's what happened January 6th during COVID when everybody had to stop. That's exactly what happened. It's a group of people that decided they wanted to go to the White House and try to F it up. Like, come on. How did that happen? This was in 2001, guys.
Iceberg. Just a peak of an iceberg. We'll debate later. Meaning what? For 4 years, 620,000 people dead. Over what? Legacy of white supremacy in the form of a slaveocracy. More Union soldiers dead than all American soldiers in World War II, each life precious. That's how deep it cut. We didn't even raise the question of what it means to be a citizen in a democratic republic in any systematic way until we raised the question, what are we going to do about these ex-slaves? What is their status? That's how deep it cut. That's how integral. That's how constitutive race has been and is in the American past and present. But it's so easy to push it to the side.
Yep.
And think that somehow the rich promise and possibility of American democracy can be enacted without confronting that legacy head on. And of course, for 12 years, America did something that was unprecedented in American history. And we see it in the development of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was very honest, of course. You recall that moment when he meets with Frederick Douglass in 1862. Frederick Douglass goes, he writes in his journal, "It's the first white man I met who feels thoroughly at home with black people." Reminds you of Bill Clinton a little bit, actually. Abraham Lincoln says what? He says, "Mr. Douglass, I admire your oratory skill." He said, "But I've been living for over 40 years with my white fellow citizens, and I'm thoroughly convinced that the vast majority of them will never, ever treat the masses of black people decently and equally. And therefore, it's best for you to look for a place in Central America. New colony." Frederick Douglass says, "I disagree with your conclusion, but I understand your insight. We got a major challenge if we're going to create a multiracial democracy." Part of the greatness of Abraham Lincoln, of course, is that, like Malcolm X, he was always growing. He was criticizing himself. By 1865, he changed his mind. He said, "I've decided to support the right of Negroes to vote in New Orleans, Louisiana. I think we might have a chance to create a multiracial democracy. It's going to be very, very difficult. Something that even the founding fathers would not have."
If you're thinking about buying or selling a house anywhere within an hour of Houston, including the blue areas on this map, did you know that you might...
And of course, 3 days later, a white supremacist with mediocre acting talent, John Wilkes Booth, put a bullet in his head because of that decision. Because of that decision. And yet there was this grand attempt. Never in the history of the modern world had there been a shift from slave status to citizenship status. Of course, in the 1870s, we had more senators then than we do now.
Okay.
Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, head of Supreme Court of South Carolina. Fascinating attempt to see whether, in fact, America.
That's a very interesting point that I never considered that aspect of things in regards to the fastest way to get citizenship within America historically has been from slave ship to citizenship after essentially when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So in saying that, that's crazy. That's a historical and looking at the trickle down effect in which how empowered the black community became in that time, after that time, per I mean him talking about having representation in New Orleans and South Carolina in the Supreme Court, having about 70 compared to now. That, that's interesting. That's interesting because given the opportunity in which society there's been like the meeting point of the black intellectuals meeting with the power, like the black intellectuals, not the rappers. No disrespect to the rappers or the athletes or like the people that you don't expect to be there. This was a situation where Frederick Douglass, a high intellectual meeting up with someone like Abraham Lincoln in order to and then changing his mind over time after Abraham Lincoln was like, you know what, these people ain't gonna fuck with y'all like that. They're not gonna mess with y'all like that. And to his defense, that's a being someone that has lived in both communities. That's absolutely true. They live in a reality, and for me, I actually agree with it in the sense of they live in a reality in which they've shared a lot with the world in regards to their ventures and voyages, but then the world is asking for them to give back, and not necessarily give back, but nonetheless, they've opened up their community so much to the stage where in certain positions, it's almost like they still want to be able to hold on to something, as we should be able to, as we should too, right? We should want that authenticity. As someone that worked with breeding bearded dragons, which are lizards, like the ones that they're called lizards from Australia, but nonetheless, having that experience with breeding dragons. The thing about breeders is some of them that tend to want like a unique color, like a bright red or a yellowish color on the bearded dragon, and that's all playing with genetics, right? But nonetheless, the fundamental ones, I mean, the basic ones and the most casual ones are actually the black dark skin, the darker ones, the dark scale or kind of like a sandy pale scale lizard. So I'm saying that all this extra dynamic of things, as a breeder, you still want that organic type lizards, nothing too exotic, just something simple. So I'm saying that the way the community has kind of opened itself up as from the racial dynamic of white just wanting to keep their own circle and black having that circle they want to keep. I completely agree with it. Like I have no problem with both communities wanting to keep that same circle. The idea is the equal playing field, right? Not the equal playing field in regards to how we can all collectively as a community build something. So I agree with what he was saying, and I'll get back to it now. Again, thank you guys for joining me. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that like if you like content like this, and I plan on creating more. Again, I watched a lot of Cornel West throughout my college career, and I definitely see him as a high intellectual, and a lot of the way he uses philosophy to kind of support most of the things that there's certain patterns in the past that tend to project in the future. The fact that we want to ignore the past so much just keeps us on an idle stage in which we're not really progressing anywhere. And I like how this was in 2001. He's bringing up these topics, and it's crazy that you looking at 2023, and it's like when you consider after the Civil War in America, January 6th was one of something that kind of like a hey, we're still here type dynamic, and that's kind of scary. I mean,
Democracy could become a multiracial democracy. And we're still not even dealing with the vicious legacy of male supremacy, let alone class hierarchy. But to create a multiracial democracy in light of Lincoln's vision after he changed his mind. And yet by 1877, you all know the story, the Confederacy lost the war, but white supremacy won the peace. Institutional terrorism sets in. Jim Crow, Jane Crow, American barbarism. 51 years, every 2.5 days, some black child, black woman, black man hanging from some tree. Strange fruit the southern trees bear that Billie Holiday sang so beautifully about. Just at the moment when America is constituting itself as a transcontinental empire with Guam and Cuba and Philippines, Hawaii, just at the moment when Europe's poor, God bless you, begin to make their way into the cheap labor markets of the United States to help facilitate the economic takeoff of the country. Legacy of white supremacy, immobilizing these people, sharecroppers, day laborers, tenant farmers, peonage, limitless debt, probably in many ways the most un-American condition, inability to move. America's all about mobility, staying on the move, right? Emerson says everything good is on the highway. Boy, that's quintessentially American. Henry Ford even made it more explicit. These folk locked in, wrestling with civic death, no rights, limited liberties in the land of liberty. And it would take nearly 80 years to hit the legacy of white supremacy head on. And I want to say something to young people about the 1960s. This is very important, the 1950s and 60s, because so much of the debate about race these days has to do with one's interpretation of the 1960s. And of course, the 60s cannot be understood unless it's understood against the backdrop of Jim Crow, Jane Crow, going back to 1877, the 12 years, and then of course, the 244 years of slavery in America, and the 79 years America as a democratic republic. But the 60s was not a period in which the vast majority of young people were flying high in the friendly skies, obsessed with rock music and Woodstock. Though some of that certainly went on. Cannot be denied. Nor was the 60s a time in which one man led one movement that broke the back of American apartheid. Martin Luther King Jr., who is now celebrated every January, oftentimes by those who, not just critical of him, had deep hostility toward him in the 1960s when his body was still moving in space and time.
Yeah, and this is important because when I consider some of the way we analyze the past heroes here and there, one of the things that he made me aware of when I started watching them a lot is that though I have my own opinion on Martin Luther King, he kind of pointed out the dynamic in which like society as a whole never agreed with him at that point in which the movement was going on. Like it was really split in regards to people that supported him. So this whole narrative of creating holiday or doing all of these things that we not now do was never really the initial. Like you wouldn't have foreseen it considering that dynamic when it was still alive and how everything essentially played out.
And that's black folk as well as white and red and yellow. He was not the HNIC, the head Negro in charge, ever. was booted out of the largest black organization in America, the National Baptist Convention. He cut against the grain in the black community. Why? Because he was against conformity. Whoso be a civil rights activist had to be a nonconformist. He called the civil rights movement the group of the maladjusted. Maladjusted to injustice and cruelty and bigotry, not well adjusted to the status quo. And I'll say a word about the middle classes these days of all colors becoming so well adjusted to things that they lose a sense of maladjusted consciousness, what it means to cut against the grain. He was against complacency because he was so committed. He was against cowardice because he had the courage to think critically and the courage to love and fight for justice. But the 60s was not solely about Brother Martin or even Sister Fanny. There were 329 uprisings in 257 cities within 4.5 years. And neither Martin nor Fanny had any control over that. The rage and the anger and the fury began to overflow. And there were 213 uprisings one night. And you all know the night I'm talking about. April 4th, 1968. Those bullets ripped through the precious body of Brother Martin on Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. National Guard brought out to protect the White House. Folk were going to de-whitenize it. Military occupation in one city for 9 months that looked like Prague, Czechoslovakia that same spring. And I'm talking about Wilmington, Delaware. You thought I was going to say Detroit, I know. Wilmington, Delaware, shaking the foundations of American society again, having to wait until crisis and catastrophe set in to see whether America had the intellectual, political, cultural, and economic resources to deal with this legacy. And yet it's so easy to fall back into business as usual, denial, avoidance, downplaying.
Yeah. And when we tie it back to like the initial thing that he was talking about from the beginning in regards to Socrates and Malcolm X responding to it in regards to like that's an unexamined life is a life not worth not an unexamined life is a life worth not living or something like that. An unexamined life is a life not worth living. So when we consider how far we've gotten in this video, and now he's bringing back how America is yet to actually do that eternal search of understanding why things are playing out till now, till like when something actually happens, right? You consider the first one being when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, essentially creating the fastest route to citizenship, which was from slave ship to citizenship immediately after that, right? And then the trauma of the Civil War. Actually, we can even go back to the Civil War, in which like that was a group of people attacking a federal dynamic and going after the U.S. and like that shook up how everything was done, and that essentially ended slavery first, right? The Civil War ended slavery, and then when you get to when JFK was killed, that was like the initial citizenship, how this free slaves, that goes into the dynamic of citizenship, slave ship to citizenship immediately. That's two dynamics. Now the third one being the 60s. He's speaking on the 60s when Martin Luther King was assassinated, also essentially creating so much uprising, and how the self-reflection is not being done but being pushed over to the side till calamity happens and it's creating chaos. But then the thing about chaos is there's beauty in it, right? There's beauty in it here and there. Again, thank you guys for joining me. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you want more content like this. I definitely, like I said, I enjoy Dr. Cornel West. I've been watching him since my college years. I think he's one of the forward thinkers. He's known as one of the top intellectuals in the Black community. So I'm very surprised that we don't pedestalize someone like this in regards to like their credential. They started at Harvard, Princeton, Yale. Like, like why don't we know this guy?
and overlooking. One of the sad things about race matters in America is that it's a national spectacle anytime you talk about the plight and predicament of indigenous brothers and sisters, people of African descent, and women. All need national legislation or acts of the court. And there's been vicious forms of discrimination against Jewish brothers and sisters, Catholic brothers and sisters, and so on, but never needing national focus and limelight. And anytime you have national focus and limelight, people begin to think it's preferential treatment. Why are you talking about them and not me?
And I spoke about this earlier too.
I say, no, white working class brother, we know you have pain.
The police don't want you to know this.
Guys, this insurance company Auto is the real deal. It's legit. Like, I'm not sure how they do it, how they find you all these state and local discounts.
And funny enough, that's kind of the point I was bringing up earlier in regards to, like, we shouldn't see this as an attack or anything of that sort. When we consider the dynamic of American history, it was a small percentage of white people that actually owned slaves. In saying that, though the community benefited, there was also the dynamic of white people that actually helped. So in saying that, if you do that eternal search without being guilt first, pushing guilt outward, and doing that internal work, you'll see that there's nothing to be guilty of. This is just a conversation from another race that has been hinged to another race, now trying to unhinge. Though they've been unhinged for years, but nonetheless, there's still that chain of connection that is saying we're still here to oppress in some dynamic of the way. So that's the point that he's getting at. You shouldn't feel it as an attack, but yet in society, that's what we always see. When we bring out the dynamic of our black contributors to the society, it's almost like those people again. Why them, not me? So again, it's all about doing that internal work, like something.
We know it's difficult to gain access to a job with a living wage. We know you have tremendous difficulty getting access to health care and child care. But we're asking you to confront the most powerful, not scapegoat the most vulnerable. We're asking you to simply say, there are ways of understanding your pain in such a way that you don't respond in a cowardly manner. I tell this to Brother Rush Limbaugh all the time. Well, not personally, but publicly. I say, Brother Rush, we know who your social base is. These white brothers have been wrestling with economic decline for the last 25 years. Economic dislocation, not even viewed as human beings who are fired, they're disposable commodities who are downsized. But they look to the weak, the immigrants, the women, the gays, the lesbians, the blacks, the browns. I say, oh, just like that husband who feels so powerless on the job and goes home to beat his wife. Cowardly, exercising power over the less powerful. You see. Saying what? Saying in part that it's so very difficult to talk about race in America, and especially the question of what it means to be human and wrestling with the forms of varieties of death in the culture. Not to reinforce the worst. And that's one of the reasons why there has been and will always be a black nationalist tradition in the black community and in America. When Marcus Garvey, who led the largest mass movement among black folk to do what? To leave the country. Most of the world wants to come. Get in on the goodies, the rights, the liberties. Marcus Garvey had 3 million black people that said what? that said, I agree with Alexis de Tocqueville. I agree with Abe Lincoln before he changed his mind. I can't conceive of a multiracial democracy. I just don't think that the vast majority of white brothers and sisters will ever treat the masses of black people decently and equally. He said, I might have a stunted imagination, but somebody give me some evidence. That is a profound question. It's in the last chapter of Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, the three races that inhabit this land, that says there'll never be a multiracial democracy here. Never. And of course, it reminds me of that poignant moment 6 weeks before his death when Martin Luther King Jr. went to visit the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Martin turned to Elijah and said, I just think that your attempt to create a black state in Georgia and Mississippi, the panhandle of Florida and Alabama is a pipe dream. I can't conceive of it ever coming about. Elijah turned back to Martin and said, and your attempt to integrate into a burning house is a pipe dream. I can't conceive of how it will ever come about. And tears flowed from both of their faces. That's the raw stuff of the blues.
Yeah.
That's what Henry Highland Garnett had in mind when he spoke in 1843 and said, black people never confuse your situation with that of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible. For you, Pharaoh was on both sides of the bloody Red Sea.
Yeah.
You are people of limited options and truncated alternatives.
That's very deep. That's very deep. Because when we know the story of Moses, right, with the slaves running away from the pharaohs, and Moses parts the seas, they pass on through, the sea covers up and takes over most of the pharaoh's guards of people, and in saying that, they're saying the pharaoh's on the other side too, or he's saying the pharaoh's on the other side too, and that's kind of like the reality in saying that the truncated opportunities, right? You think you have an option, and that's one of the things that I've always analyzed in life in regards to like thinking we have more options than we really do. And that's why a lot of times when I sit back and look at all these people that really, though they have great imagination, it's almost like, where is the plan? Where is the path that you're following? Because you really don't have the options you think you do. You're thinking you're gonna push things off later, but nonetheless, like that, there's a now, right? And yeah, so I think him pointing it out in freaking 2001. It's crazy.
What are you gonna do? Du Bois raised the question. We got to keep fighting. Well, in the 1960s, when Martin left the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's house and then went to see Amiri Baraka in Newark, New Jersey, who was then a black nationalist. That was about his third incarnation. He's serious about each one, though, isn't he? Boy, he's full of fire. I love my brother Baraka. I love my brother Baraka. He told Martin the same thing. And that dialogue still haunts us. Namely, as we move from the late 60s after the death of Brother Martin to the year 2001, we have seen the ways in which breakthroughs have taken place. Progress certainly has occurred, but what is the nature of that progress? Brother Malcolm used to say, you don't stab a man in the back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches and celebrate your progress. But the progress is still real. Look at the University of Washington. All these colorful faces. People died so that this place could be more true to its quest for truth and knowledge and come to terms with its.
Yeah, and one of the things that I try to really do, pay homage to the historical base of when I was in college, right? Like the historical base that has been set, the foundation that has been set for us, I try to always pay homage to it and acknowledge them whenever I can. And in saying that, there's also this dynamic of people wanting immediate results, thinking we haven't made any progress yet. the naysayer, so to speak. And it's like, if only you know what was going on in the past, that if we dealt with today, will make us completely go insane. Completely. Imagine a situation where they say because you're this color, you can't have a cell phone. In that situation, you would be so handicapped. You would be so handicapped. What would education mean to you at that point? You don't know how to utilize a flip phone, a Nokia flip phone, a razor, a Nokia razor. Imagine not being able to understand a Nokia razor in this society that we're living in with smartphones. That and per because of your race, you can't have that. Imagine that situation. So definitely an handicap.
Its own legacy of white supremacy. And progress has been made. But is it one in which the unprecedented opportunities for the middle classes, the upper middle classes, a few of the black and brown and red well-to-do, becomes the center of attention, and the plight or predicament of working class brothers and sisters, working poor brothers and sisters of all colors, very poor brothers and sisters, the increase in deep poverty, those fellow citizens who make 50% of the poverty level income, increasing. And very little attention, limelight, or preoccupation with them as their lives become more impoverished, chaotic, dislocated, deracinated, and lacerated. Raw cannon fodder for the criminal justice system that targets them with a war against drugs, very much a war on poor, black and brown and white men.
Recordings just got better. Hey, it's Dana from StreamYard. I'm so excited to announce that local recording.
A doubling of the prison system in the last 6 years, 2.1 fellow human beings in prison. More black prisoners now than all of American prisoners 5 years ago. Where's the discourse? Their destiny is linked to our destiny. We're all on the same ship, and if that ship has huge leaks in it, we go up together, we go down together. Where is the democratic sensibility there? Which is to say, public interest, common good. How do we relate to each other as fellow citizens, mediating our disagreements with civility and mutual respect? That's why that first question of what it means to be human is inseparable from the second that the Black Freedom Movement has always raised. Are we serious about democratic ideals and practices? Or is it for the most part a lip service that we use to hide and conceal the oligarchic, plutocratic, to some degree, pigmentocratic economy? Are we serious about the fundamental question of any democracy, which is how do we curtail the use of arbitrary power against fellow citizens? And you always begin with the most immediate form of arbitrary power, which is police power. Police power. That's the litmus test. That's the litmus test. If somehow we think that deploying arbitrary police power, I didn't say legitimate police power, and I certainly don't want to demonize policemen. They're human beings and fellow citizens, they're part of working class. The salary's too low, risk too high. But too many of them trigger happy when it comes to blackmail bodies.
One of the things I could appreciate about Cornel West in regards to this conversation that he's having is simply the fact that he actually tries to find a balance, right? Before he dives into a point, he will bring it down in order to say, hey, look, this is not an attack on you, right? I could sympathize, I could empathize, and I could put myself in your position, right? But nonetheless, we can all sit back and still say there's still this dynamic in which one is it's unnecessarily, the chaos is unnecessarily maximized to an extent for you to actually take a step back. And again, most of this conversation has been it all ties back to the Socrates dynamic in which he said, "An unexamined life is a life not worth living." And in doing that, Malcolm X's rebuttal in regards to saying that an examined life is hard, and it's why it's unexamined, right? So in saying that, it all ties back to self-reflection, right? It's that internal search in which it's not to blame, it's not to shame. Nonetheless, it's the dynamic of being objective about the situation. The sky is blue. The sky is blue, right? In saying that, this is not a need for extra interpretations as far as like, oh, it's because of the ray of the sun hitting the none of that, right? None of that. It's simply what we see and the objectivity of it, right? Not the nuances that come behind it. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate. He keeps that balance, right? And then he ties it back to just saying, well, look, I understand you guys are going through this too, but nonetheless, this is the point that I want to bring out in regards to dealing with the policing dynamic.
Brown male bodies. You see. Just reading the New York Times today, all 4 officers shot Brother Diallo 41 times. No discipline whatsoever. A little retraining on ethnic sensitivity. Just in Sacramento, where I grew up, another 17-year-old black brother, tip of the iceberg. Across the board. And it affects each and every one of us as citizens. Arbitrary power deployed. Could be corporate power. Arbitrary governmental power. There, I'm with the right-wing brothers and sisters. I'm not for a big government out of control that has no accountability. But corporate power, often unaccountable, deploying its arbitrary power against working people. Individual power, men against women, straight against gay, lesbian. That's what a democracy is. If we're serious about it, then we cast the national limelight on it. Of course, I'm not suggesting it doesn't take place at all in America. Part of the greatness of the country is there's always been a leaven in the loaf. There's always been citizens of all colors who are willing to attempt to cast a limelight on it, but they always cut against the grain.
That's the balance that I was talking about.
Against the dominant grain. But see, democracy is more than just a mode of governance. It's a way of being in the world. It is experimental, improvisational, jazz-like. It's about fundamentally believing those who Sly Stone call everyday people have a sense of the tragic and majestic and problematic shot through their lives, and they are just as valuable as elites. Sly say everybody is a star.
Yeah.
Earth, Wind, and Fire say everybody's a shining star. Each and every one of us, unique, distinctive, irreproducible.
Right.
Of value, dignity. Christian discourse in the eyes of God, Imago Dei. Judaic discourse, Imago Dei. Islamic discourse, Imago Dei. Buddhists, Hindus, all have their own formulations in their prophetic form of the uniqueness of each and every one of us. And then, of course, James Weldon Johnson and his brother Rosamond come along and say that's why we ought to lift every voice. And when the voices of the demos, the voices of everyday people, those who the late, great James Cleveland called ordinary people, when their voices are heard, they would not choose dilapidated housing. They wouldn't choose decrepit schools, systems of education in our public life. They wouldn't choose jobs that don't provide a living wage. They wouldn't choose lack of health care or unavailable child care. Their voices must be hemorrhaged when it comes to fundamental decisions being made in the society. That's what it means of taking democracy seriously all the way down. Now, granted, there's always counter-majoritarian institutions like courts that must preserve the very conditions for the possibility of democracy, rights, liberties, freedom of association, speech and worship. Yes. But who really takes democracy seriously? That's cross color. We can look at the art form of jazz. You better find your voice, accent your individuality in community so you can contribute to the high quality of the collective performance. John Coltrane, quit imitating Johnny Hodges. Imitation is suicide. Find your voice. Each citizen, dig deep into the precincts of your own soul and examine the suburbs of your heart and find your voice and get it out. Not just your self-interest,
right?
But your voice that balances enlightened self-interest with public interest and common good. And by voice here, I'm not just talking about votes in Florida now.
I absolutely agree with what he's saying there, because that goes back to what I was saying, right? Let's break it down to how we can analyze it, everything we've heard up to this stage, right? In regards to some of the things that he's talking about, his fundamental base in which he started off with was with Socrates, the internal search, right? An unexamined life is a life not worth living. Hence, with Malcolm X rebutting that and saying an examined life is hard, right? In this situation, it's saying raise your voice. How do you raise your voice if you haven't done the self-reflection yet? The idea of that self-reflection is to really sit back and analyze yourself, right? Analyze your purpose, analyze everything that you've experienced. And funny enough, it ties back to the video I was watching yesterday regarding how the education system has evolved over time, and how, like in 1988 in Chicago, when the kids were being interviewed, which is a video I made in my previous the previous video I made about the thinking man. So in saying that, when you consider how everything has evolved over time, being able to do that self-reflection, that's when that self-confidence comes into play. Because when we consider how I ended up the video yesterday with with Professor Nawanse, in order to get out of the peer pressure dynamic, as we have a social peer pressure dynamic, you have to get back to the other side, which is the self-reflection. Now, in order to get that self-confidence, you have to do the self-reflection. What is your purpose here? And when you consider what your purpose here is, one of the things Professor Nawanse pointed out yesterday from my review was God. When you have that good relationship with God, you tend to find that your balance. You know where you find that balance. Though the journey with God is never going to be straightforward, but nonetheless, when you have that relationship with God, it's easy for you to follow a path, right? And after God, you can basically, to put it in this manner, what creates your self identity in order for you to do this self reflection is, do you have God as a foundation in regards to the path you're following, and then your parents, whatever God you might be following, and then your parents, the foundation they've established for you, and using that as a reference as to like what your self value is. And then after that, your teachers, right? Because in that dynamic, I'll speak in the video I made with Dr. Norenzi yesterday. The idea was how the education system is and how you can find your identity outside of the peer pressure, right? And we said God, your parents, and then your teachers, using them. And the fourth one was also luck. And the luck dynamic I spoke on yesterday too definitely contributes a lot to that self-reflection aspect of success in academic. But nonetheless, I'll get back to it. Again, thank you guys for watching. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. And I'll definitely bring you guys more contents like this. I definitely enjoy
We'll
comedy.
talk about that later, but that's a reductionist. Though it's still a problem. But it's much deeper than that, because of course, when large slices of the demos feel as if their voice is not being heard, they feel helpless, impotent, turn on themselves, they turn on each other. Every generation, in wrestling with the question of what it means to be human and how one takes democracy seriously, has to accent the underside of their present moment in light of the past to ensure that the future can be a little bit better and maybe even qualitatively better than the present. We were here in 1941, 3 fragile democracies in the whole world. We talk about fascist forces, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Japanese militaristic elites crushing all democratic possibility. So even a white supremacist democracy like America is, in the eyes of most of us, worth fighting for, in a segregated army in which black soldiers were treated worse than German prisoners of war in many instances. America still worth fighting for. Why? Because if Hitler takes over, the whole world is niggerized, other than Germans. Open season on them, treat them anyway, subject to abusive power. This is the generation Brother Tom Brokaw so excited about, and rightly so. They met a grand challenge. We're here in 1965, break the back of American apartheid, or we slide down a slippery slope to chaos and anarchy because we would be at each other's throats. And young folk may take it for granted, but there was a kind of war going on. Many, many casualties to keep alive the best of American democracy as it confronted that particular version of white supremacy. Year 2001. What are the challenges, especially for the younger generation? First, relation between race and escalating, galloping wealth inequality. 1% of the population own 48% of the net financial wealth, and the next 7% own another 30%. And it has been increasing over the last 15 years, be the administration Democratic or Republican, both beholden to disproportionate amount of corporate influence, transnational corporate influence and domestic corporate influence. No serious discussion about it. The sacred cow of American democracy being economic growth by means of corporate priorities. If we don't keep that growth going by means of corporate priorities, the very conditions of American stability go under. And we've seen what? Real hourly wages of working people increased 4% over 20-some years, and CEO salaries increased 425%. CEO salaries for the Fortune 500 companies, 925%. Now, between 1945 and 1973, corporate profits go up, wages went up. Why? A contract had been made, a consensus had been reached, a workers' movement in place that ensured high levels of productivity, workers can get in on it. It snaps in the 70s. It's now corporations mean and lean for stockholders and workers trying to adjust the best way they can. That's why we have 6.5 million fellow citizens who work 6.5 million fellow citizens of moms and dads who work 4 jobs between those two. 4 jobs in one family. Don't receive a penny from the federal government. Frugal, thrifty, deferring gratification, but still making very little progress. Hardly any talk about this at all. And of course, on the international level, my God.
Yeah, this is the dynamic in which it gets into the corporate dynamic of that self-reflection we have to do in regards to we claim to push democracy on the world, but nonetheless, when we do the self-reflection, the corporatization of all of this is essentially one that in some cases kind of combats the democracy image that we're projecting, right? In regards to like the CEO making almost, I don't even know the amount, but nonetheless, they're making a lot, way more than they could be supplementing their workers. Nonetheless, the workers are having to adjust. And one of the things he always brings up is funny enough, it hasn't happened yet, but one of the things he brings up is some of the some of the situation that actually happened in '08 in regards to the market crashing, he really gets on Obama over it. Like that's one of his biggest problem with Obama was the fact that Obama accepted a lot of the Wall Street people that were making bad deals and doing insider trade. Like he really, and this is in 2001 with this mannerism and this structure of thinking against corporations. Like he, after that, like yeah, I'll get back to it. Again, thank you guys for watching. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. I'll definitely bring more contents like this. Again, I have a high reverence for Cornel West. Throughout my mechanical engineering studies at the University of Texas in Dallas, I really connected with his ideologies a lot throughout that my schooling. I would play him in the background while doing my assignments, and just being able to find that intellectual mind like his was something I appreciated. So again, thank you guys, and hope you enjoy this part. This
One individual has wealth equivalent to the bottom 48 countries. And that individual is no longer in Seattle. You got a new one now. Brother Bill Gates always struck me as a highly generous brother. I've never met him before. He gives quite generously in the form of philanthropy. And philanthropy is a very rich tradition in America, but we must never confuse charity with justice. Charity is much better than no charity. Don't get me wrong. And even the well-to-do are human beings who make choices and decisions that can have positive effects. No finger pointing, a name calling, a pigeonholing, let alone demonizing. But we're talking about structures and institutions. The top 100 individuals have wealth equivalent to the bottom 48% of humankind, 2.6 billion human beings. Where's the discourse? It's hard to generate it. It began here in Seattle in part in terms of putting it on the national and international scene. People may be preoccupied with some of the anarchistically inclined brothers and sisters. I have my own critiques I can bring to bear, but they were not the only ones here in Seattle. Not at all. People concerned about corporate-driven globalization as opposed to democratically driven globalization, mechanisms of accountability for all of the productivity and wealth being produced. Look at NAFTA now, 27% decline in Mexican workers' wages. That was supposed to be so grand and progressive. How do we measure it? Are their economies better? Well, what do you mean by economy here? Is it from the vantage point of Wall Street or is it from the vantage point of the workplace? And most importantly, especially younger generation understands this better than older brothers like me. We look at American society through the vantage point of the most vulnerable, children. Not just the 19% of children living in poverty across color. It's only 4% in Japan. Only 7% in Germany, which is a country not known to be on the cutting edge of the barbaric 20th century in regard to social justice. 19%. 45% of red children. 42% of brown. 40% of black children, 100% of the future. Where's the discourse? Where's the focus? One of the things I like about George W. Bush is that at least he shifted the discourse to the plight of children in the inner city in regard to education. Couldn't get that out of Bill Clinton. He was more concerned about the swing vote. Couldn't get it out of Al Gore. He's more concerned about the swing vote. He couldn't even mention the phrase poor children.
Wow.
Always middle class, and he began to say working class with a little populist twist when the polls began to fall. I may disagree with George W. Bush's free marketeer responses, how you deal with that plight. But it's the focus that is so necessary. Why? Because we have never seen a generation so isolated, lonely, alienated, spiritually suffering from spiritual malnutrition and existential emptiness in the history of the country. All you have to do is visit a public school in any, not just Chocolate City, but vanilla suburb too. San Diego's just the tip of an iceberg. Columbine, tip of an iceberg. Why? Families weak, communities feeble, neighborhoods transformed into hoods. And that's just not in black and brown communities. I'm talking about suburbs too.
Yeah.
A hood is a place where social Darwinian sensibilities are predominant, in which people are obsessed with the survival of the slickest. Preoccupied with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. 71% of high school students say they cheat regularly on exams because it's all about that American goal of success, capital S.
Yeah, and that pretty much ties back to what I was saying initially at the beginning of this video in regards to. I lost my train of thought when I was saying it, but nonetheless, it's funny how he's bringing it up now in regards to how when you're getting an education, you're thinking in this path of, oh, I'm here to get the education. Education is relevant. People actually know what they're doing. But then you see the business side of it, and you're like, oh, what? This is not the same. This is not what I thought it was. I'm doing the job and I'm doing the work, but nonetheless, these other people are doing other stuff, and I'm over here looking like, how, how, how? I'm over here spending 80, like I'm doing the work. But one thing I tend to I learned is that every place has their own culture, right? And in saying that, every culture within, even though it's a universal culture, there's tools and things here and there that once you explain in a different dynamic, you you tend to see that there's no engineering, there's no genius here. There's just people using certain paths to accomplish certain things that you weren't exposed to. But then you see that it's not necessarily the idea of getting the education itself, like the love of the education, but it's the politics behind the image that the school wants, or the politics behind the image that would be sought after by corporations, right? And that's where the corporatization comes into play, because now when you get into the you have dynamics of diversity hires, or the situation of affirmative action, which was just stricken down. Right now, people are, my personal take on that is that there's more to affirmative action than what was argued in regards to why it was stricken down. Because at the end of the day, why did it have to be there in the first place? For the race that is arguing against it, not understanding the full understanding of why it exists in the first place, is like, it's very telling. I would say it's very telling. But I'm glad that he brought back the dynamic of how education is not the same way we thought it was. It's like this ploy of trying to get in where you fit in, if you understand how it's being played.
Get over by any means. It's part of the significance of the hip hop culture. One of the creative breakthroughs of the last 30 years, where the younger generation engages in an indictment of the older generation that says, you haven't given us enough love, care, attention. You left us drifting. We have to raise ourselves. We'll create our own Black CNN to provide advice and counsel as to how to grow up. Because you older folk are too preoccupied with other things: careerism, hedonism, narcissism, individualism. What an indictment. And then we get upset about gangster rap. And they say, look, what we see is the ultimate logic of this market-driven culture obsessed with buying and spending and promoting and advertising is the gangsterization of culture. We see gangster activity in White House, State House, City Hall, church, mosque, temple. That's what we see. Now, we might be a little more raw and coarse in our forms of expression, but isn't it all about that fetish of our day, the market, which is a legal and human construct that can do good things and bad things and under various conditions? But women ascribe magical powers to it. It's all about getting over. Win the election at any cost. And that's 1996. The financial scandal. 2000, any cost. I'm here now. Don't worry about the past. I'm here now. We moved in. What was the process? Young folks see that.
Yeah.
No such thing as young people's behavior that's not disproportionately influenced by older people's behavior. Can a democracy survive with such a market-driven culture in which non-market activities are pushed to the margin? And of course, the ultimate non-market activity in American culture is parenting, caring, loving, supporting, nurturing, push to the margin.
Yeah.
And we see the results.
Yeah, we do. Really.
Will the younger generation have what it takes to revitalize, regenerate, and reinvigorate the best of American democracy? That's an open question. And to talk about this through the prism of race is not to remain stuck in that prism, but to make sure we don't sidestep it, but take us to higher levels of its relation to class, gender, corporate power, patriarchal power. You all been very kind and patient. I want to bring this to an end. But I want to end on the blue note. You can see I'm not optimistic. I don't believe in optimism. I don't believe in pessimism. Black folks saying I've been down so long, the down don't worry me no more, but I'll keep struggling anyway. That is not an optimistic statement nor a pessimistic statement. It's neither sentimental nor cynical. It's an expression of hope, and hope is not the same thing as optimism. Never confuse or conflate hope with optimism. Hope cuts against the grain. Hope is participatory. It's an agent in the world. Optimism looks at the evidence and see whether it allows us to infer that we can do X or Y. Hope says, I don't give a damn, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it anyway.
I like that. I like that. I like that. I like that.
When white brothers and sisters undergo the metamorphosis by means of critical thinking,
Like that.
by means of compassion, they say, I'm going to fight against white supremacy. I'm not asking permission from anybody. I might not even be popular in the black community. I'm not asking for their permission. I'm doing it because it's right and it's just and it's moral, and I want to be that kind of person.
Yep. That's that self.
I want that kind of society.
That's that self-reflection.
I'm against heterosexism for the same reason, anti-Arab sensibility for the same reason. Why? Because that's the kind of trace I want to leave. That's the kind of legacy I want to leave behind. That's the Socratic note and the blue note coming together. It's mediated with the prophetic and the humanistic. And it says, of course, if you're a prisoner of hope, you'll be wrestling with despair. Goethe is right. He or she who has never despaired has never lived. You don't know what it is to be human if you never wrestle with despair, but never allow that despair to have the last word.
Right.
And it's that effort, that sense of engagement that has kept the best of American democracy alive. Can we do it in the year 2001? Open question. It might be that the civilization is in such deep decline and decay that, like Rome, it will simply begin to slowly slide down the slope. All civilizations come and go, and there will come a day when American civilization dies like every civilization. But let's hope that it doesn't take place on our watch. That's all I'm saying. And I say to you, for those who are willing to meet the challenge, I'll be there with you because I'm going down swinging like Sarah Vaughan, Duke Ellington, and Muhammad Ali. Thank you all so very much. Stay strong.
That's good. I really appreciate taking this time to give me that for YouTube actually taking the University of Washington actually having them at their establishment. University of Washington in Seattle, April 21st or 27th, 2001 was what I just presented to you guys. It was definitely a great watch. Thank you guys for joining me. Go ahead and hit that subscribe, like button. I definitely bring more contents like this. Again, thank you so much. Hope you have a great one. Bye for now.